It was a morning like no other. The sun rose over Key West, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a golden glow over the water. The air was warm, thick with the promise of summer, and the gentle breeze carried with it the salty tang of the ocean. This was the day Jack, Ryan, and Mike had been eagerly awaiting. It was a day meant for adventure, for the thrill of the hunt, and for the camaraderie that only the open sea could foster. Jack, the oldest of the trio at 32, was the proud owner of the Marlin's Edge, a 28-foot center console fishing boat that he had spent the last 5 years meticulously maintaining and upgrading. A former Navy man, Jack had an unshakable confidence in his skills as a captain. His boat was his pride and joy, a testament to his love for the sea and the freedom it offered. Today he wore his usual attire: board shorts, a faded navy t-shirt, and a baseball cap that had seen better days. His face was tanned and weathered from years spent under the sun, but his eyes held the sparkle of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. Ryan, at 29, was Jack's younger friend from childhood. A software developer by trade, Ryan had a different relationship with the ocean. He was not as seasoned as Jack, but he loved the escape that fishing offered, a break from the relentless pace of the tech world. Ryan had joined Jack on many trips before, but this one felt different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation, an unspoken challenge that hung in the air. He dressed in cargo shorts and a breathable fishing shirt, his hands busy checking and rechecking his tackle box, ensuring that every lure and line was in perfect order. Mike, the youngest of the group at 27, was the wild card. A freelance photographer, Mike had a knack for capturing the wild and untamed beauty of the natural world. His portfolio was filled with breathtaking shots of the ocean, but his love for the sea was tempered by a healthy respect for its dangers. Unlike Jack and Ryan, who had grown up near the coast, Mike was a transplant from the Midwest, where the only bodies of water were lakes and rivers. He had quickly adapted to the coastal life, though, and now couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Today, his camera was safely stowed in a waterproof case, ready to capture the moments that would define their trip. The plan was simple: head south 20 to 30 miles into the deep blue waters of the Atlantic, troll for mahi-mahi, wahoo, and tuna, then return home with a bounty of fresh fish and stories to last a lifetime. It was a trip they had been planning for months, and everything seemed perfect. The weather forecast was clear, the sea was calm, and the boat was stocked with everything they could possibly need: fishing gear, food, drinks, and even a few cigars for celebrating their inevitable catches. The Marlin's Edge glided smoothly out of the marina, the powerful twin outboard engines roaring to life as they left the dock behind. Jack stood at the helm, his hand steady on the wheel, guiding the boat through the familiar channels and out into the open ocean. The water shimmered under the morning sun, the waves gentle and inviting. Ryan and Mike busied themselves with the lines, preparing the rods and lures, their excitement growing. "Today's the day, boys," Jack called out over the hum of the engines. "I can feel it. We're going to bring in a big one." "Damn right," Ryan agreed, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of fish. "I've been dreaming about this all week." Mike grinned, adjusting his hat to shield his eyes from the sun. "Let's make some memories, fellas." As the boat powered further offshore, the land gradually disappeared from view, replaced by the endless expanse of the deep blue sea. The world shrank to just the three of them and the boat, a tiny speck on the vast ocean. They were 30 miles out when Jack slowed the boat to trolling speed, the lines paid out, trailing behind them, cutting through the water like knives. The air was filled with the rhythmic thrum of the engines and the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Time seemed to stretch out as they waited for the first strike. Hours passed with little more than a few nibbles and a lot of false alarms. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat intensifying, but their spirits remained high. They passed the time with jokes and stories, reminiscing about past trips and speculating on what they might catch today. But as the day wore on and the fish remained elusive, a subtle tension began to creep in. Jack could feel it, a nagging sensation at the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. The sea, usually so full of life, seemed oddly quiet. The fish, the birds, even the breeze, they were all conspicuously absent. It was as if the ocean was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Maybe we should try a different spot," Mike suggested, breaking the silence. Jack considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "We've come this far. Let's give it a little more time. The fish are out here. We just need to find them." Ryan nodded in agreement, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. He glanced at the horizon, where the sky and sea blurred together, and for a moment felt a bit apprehensive about being out so far. He kept his thoughts to himself, not wanting to spoil the mood. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the deck, the unthinkable happened. Without warning, the engine sputtered and died, leaving the boat adrift in the middle of nowhere. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, his heart skipping a beat. He checked the gauges, then tried to restart the engines, but there was no response. "We've got fuel." "Why won't it start?" Ryan and Mike exchanged worried glances as Jack continued to fiddle with the controls, his frustration mounting. After several failed attempts, he gave up and stepped away from the helm, running a hand through his hair. "All right, let's figure this out," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Ryan, check the fuel lines. Mike, see if there's anything caught in the props." They sprang into action, but their efforts proved fruitless. The fuel lines were clear, the props were unobstructed, and there was no obvious reason why the engines wouldn't start. They tried everything they could think of, checking the fuses, inspecting the battery, even manually priming the fuel pumps, but nothing worked. As the reality of their situation began to sink in, a heavy silence fell over the boat. They were stranded, 30-plus miles from shore, with no way to call for help. The VHF radio was dead, and Jack's handheld radio, which he had on board as a backup, was useless, with dead batteries. Far from cell service, their isolation became starkly apparent. The sun was setting now, casting an eerie orange glow over the water. The once beautiful sky was now a reminder of their predicament, the darkness creeping in like an unwelcome guest. Jack, Ryan, and Mike gathered on the deck, their faces etched with concern. "We'll figure this out," Jack said, more to himself than to the others. "We just need to stay calm." Ryan nodded, though his mind was racing. He couldn't help but think about all the things that could go wrong. Dehydration, starvation, exposure. They had enough food and water for a few days, but after that, the thought made his stomach churn. Mike, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, at least we've got a great view. Not everyone gets to see a sunset like this." But his attempt at humor fell flat. The gravity of their situation was too great to ignore. They were at the mercy of the sea, and the sea was a cruel mistress. Night fell. The men agreed to rest and wait for daylight to try troubleshooting again. But sleep was impossible. Every sound, every movement of the boat kept them on edge. The first light of dawn brought no comfort. The clear weather mocked them with its perfection, the sun beating down relentlessly as they drifted aimlessly on the open ocean. The boat's hardtop offered scant shade, and tempers began to fray under the brutal heat. They took turns trying to solve the mystery of the engines, but their efforts were in vain. They remained stubbornly silent. as if the boat itself had given up. By the third day, the situation had grown dire. They rationed water from the melted ice, their supply of beverages long depleted. Food was running low, and what little they had left offered no real sustenance. The tackle tray, their last hope for a substantial meal, was accidentally knocked into the abyss when Ryan, in a moment of frustration, threw a half-empty water bottle that bounced off the console and sent the tray flying overboard. All they had left were trolling rods and spinning gear, rendered nearly useless by missing hooks. The once hopeful atmosphere had soured into a grim realization of their predicament. The sun continued its merciless assault, each day a grueling test of endurance. The banter that had once flowed so easily between them was gone, replaced by tense silence and occasional outbursts of anger. Ryan found himself growing increasingly frustrated with Jack. He silently blamed him for their situation, for not properly maintaining the boat, for not having a backup plan, for leading them into this mess. But he kept his thoughts to himself, knowing that voicing them would only make things worse. Mike, too, was struggling. The lack of food and water was taking its toll, and he found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than his growing hunger and thirst. He tried to stay positive, but as the days dragged on, his optimism began to wane. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were in serious trouble. On the fifth day, a small miracle occurred. Ryan managed to hook a fish with a trolling rod, and for a moment, it felt like they had been given a second chance. The three men erupted in cheers, their spirits momentarily lifted. As the fish surfaced, Ryan's joy turned to dread. It was a Nassau grouper, a protected species. "We can't keep it," Ryan insisted, fumbling for the pliers. "Are you insane?" Jack barked. "We need to eat." Mike lunged to grab the fish, and a struggle ensued. In the chaos, the grouper wriggled free and disappeared into the deep. Silence fell over the boat, broken only by the sound of the waves. Disbelief and anger hung in the air. "That was our chance!" Mike shouted, his voice cracking. Ryan stood his ground, his hands shaking. "We can't break the law, not even now. It's protected for a reason." "Law?" Jack spat, his eyes blazing with anger. "We're talking about survival, Ryan. You want to die out here because you're too stubborn to bend the rules?" The argument escalated, voices rising as the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. The shouting went on for several minutes, but it didn't matter now. The damage was done. The fish was gone, and with it, their fleeting hope. Mike and Jack retreated to the opposite end of the boat, nursing their anger and despair. Ryan remained where he was, staring out at the water, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The days that followed were a blur of hunger, thirst, and growing desperation. They were barely more than shadows of their former selves, weakened and incoherent. The sun, once a source of warmth and life, had become their tormentor, sapping what little strength they had left. On the 8th day, they were too far gone to notice the ferry bearing down on them, too beyond themselves to even hear the loud blast of the horn that shattered the silence. A crew member spotted the men in the drifting vessel and shouted out to them, but there was no response. The captain was notified, and he immediately slowed the ferry and made a radio call to the Coast Guard. Crew were deployed in a small boat to investigate and provide assistance to the lifeless vessel and men. As the Coast Guard arrived and boarded the Marlin's Edge, they found Jack, Ryan, and Mike barely clinging to consciousness. Their lips were cracked, and their skin was burned from the relentless sun. The men were lifted onto the Coast Guard vessel, their bodies limp and unresponsive. Medical personnel immediately started intravenous fluids and assessed their condition. The ride back to shore was a somber one. The joy of rescue was overshadowed by the gravity of what they had endured. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, too weak to speak, too exhausted to process what had happened. The once strong bond between them had been fractured, and the weight of their ordeal hung heavy in the air. Hours later, as they lay in hospital beds, rehydrated and recovering, the reality of their ordeal began to sink in. They had come dangerously close to the edge of survival. The doctors told them that had they been found a day later, it might have been too late. The experience left an indelible mark on their spirits, a harsh reminder of the sea's unforgiving nature. Ryan was the first to regain some semblance of strength. As he lay in his hospital bed, the memories of their ordeal played over and over in his mind. The image of the grouper slipping away haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the danger they were in, he had made the right choice. But the looks on Jack's and Mike's faces as the fish swam free were etched into his memory. Expressions of betrayal, desperation, and anger. Once he was discharged, Ryan spent days recuperating at home, alone with his thoughts. The more he reflected on what had happened, the more he realized that he couldn't let things end this way. Jack and Mike were his friends. No, they were more than that. They were his brothers in arms, his partners in the battle against the sea. He couldn't let a single mistake, no matter how grave, destroy the bond they had shared for years. So, with a mixture of hope and trepidation, Ryan reached out to Jack. He sent a message, then another, apologizing for the tension that had arisen between them. He tried to explain his reasoning, how he had been trying to do the right thing by not keeping the protected fish, how he had believed that following the law was necessary. But there was no response. Undeterred, Ryan tried again, this time reaching out to Mike. He explained how sorry he was that the situation had gotten out of hand, that he regretted how things had turned out, and that he desperately wanted to fix things between them. But again, his messages were met with silence. A week later, Ryan decided to visit Jack in person. He couldn't stand the thought of their friendship being over, not without at least talking it out face to face. He drove to Jack's house, his heart pounding in his chest, and knocked on the door. Jack answered after a moment, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, Ryan thought he saw a flicker of the old camaraderie in Jack's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard look. "Jack," Ryan began, his voice strained, "can we talk? I feel terrible about what happened out there. I just want to make things right." Jack stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched. "There's nothing to talk about, Ryan. You made your choice out there, and so did we." "But Jack," Ryan pleaded, "I was trying to do what I thought was right. I didn't want to break the law, not even to save ourselves. I thought you'd understand." "Understand?" Jack's voice was low, simmering with barely contained anger. "You were the reason we nearly died, Ryan. That fish meant the difference between life and death, and you threw it away. There's no coming back from that." Ryan felt a knot tighten in his chest, the weight of Jack's words crushing him. "I'm sorry, Jack. I'm really, truly sorry. But Jack cut him off with a shake of his head. "Go home, Ryan. This conversation is over." The door closed in Ryan's face, the finality of it hitting him like a physical blow. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, willing it to open again. But it didn't. Still unwilling to give up, Ryan made one last attempt to reach out to Mike. He showed up at Mike's apartment a few days later, desperate to find some common ground, some way to mend the rift that had formed between them. Mike answered the door, his expression distant and guarded. He didn't invite Ryan in, but he didn't close the door either. "Mike, I'm so sorry," Ryan began, his voice shaking. I never meant for things to go the way they did. I thought I was doing the right thing." Mike let out a long sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Ryan, you don't get it, do you? Out there, it wasn't about the law. It was about survival. You made a choice, and that choice put all our lives at risk. I can't just forget that." Ryan's eyes stung with unshed tears. "But Mike, we've been through so much together. We can't let this ruin everything." Mike shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, Ryan, but I can't trust you anymore. Not after what happened." The door closed softly, leaving Ryan standing alone in the hallway. The rejection stung, cutting deeper than any physical wound he had ever experienced. He had tried to mend the rift, to explain himself, to apologize, but it was clear now that the damage was irreparable. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ryan realized that he would never be able to repair the bond that had once held the three of them together. The silence from Jack and Mike was deafening, a constant reminder of the rift that had formed between them. He could feel the distance growing, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. The pain of their rejection gnawed at Ryan, but as time passed, he began to understand their perspective. In their eyes, he had chosen principles over survival, law over life. It was a choice they couldn't forgive, and one he would have to live with for the rest of his life. Eventually, Ryan made the decision to leave Key West. The memories of the ocean, once a source of joy and freedom, had become tainted by the ordeal. He moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, far from the coast, seeking solace in the quiet forests and misty mountains. There, he found some semblance of peace, though the weight of his decisions and their consequences would always be with him. Back in Key West, Jack and Mike tried to move on as well. The Marlin's Edge had been towed back to shore and was in desperate need of repairs. Jack, who had once taken such pride in maintaining the boat himself, found that he couldn't bring himself to touch it. The memories of those harrowing days at sea were too fresh, too painful. For weeks, the boat sat in the marina, a silent reminder of what they had endured. But as time passed, Jack's resolve began to return. He knew that the sea was in his blood, that he couldn't stay away forever. Slowly, he began the process of repairing the boat, determined to restore it to its former glory. He replaced the engines, upgraded the electrical system, and installed new safety equipment. He double-checked every line, every connection, making sure that nothing was overlooked. The VHF radio was replaced, and Jack made sure to carry a fully charged backup handheld radio, along with spare batteries. He also invested in an emergency beacon and a satellite phone, ensuring that he would never be cut off from help again. But the most significant change Jack made was in his approach to safety. He had always been confident in his abilities, but now he was almost overly cautious. Every time he planned a trip, he left a detailed float plan with a family member or friend, outlining his intended route, expected return time, and backup plans. He insisted on running thorough checks of all equipment before leaving the dock, even if it meant delaying a trip. Months passed before Jack felt ready to take the Marlin's Edge back out on the water. When the day finally came, he was filled with a mix of emotions: nervousness, anticipation, and a deep sense of responsibility. Mike joined him, though their friendship was now more reserved, the easy camaraderie of the past replaced by a quiet understanding of what they had been through. As they pulled out of the marina, Jack couldn't help but glance at the radio, the GPS, and the backup systems he had meticulously prepared. He had learned the hard way that the sea could be unforgiving, that even the most experienced sailors could be caught off guard. But he had also learned that he could survive, adapt, and move forward. The boat sliced through the water, the engines purring smoothly beneath them. The sky was clear, the sea calm. A perfect day for fishing. But this time, Jack didn't take anything for granted. He knew that the ocean held both beauty and danger, that it could offer both life and death. And he was determined to respect it, to be prepared for whatever it might throw at him. As the Marlin's edge moved further from shore, Jack felt a sense of closure, of coming full circle. The memories of their ordeal would always be with him, a part of who he was, but now he could face the sea with renewed caution and a deeper appreciation for the fragile balance between man and nature. Jack looked over at Mike, who was adjusting the lines with quiet concentration. They exchanged a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the past and the uncertain future. They might never fully regain the easy friendship they once had, but they had survived, and that was enough. And as the horizon stretched out before them, endless and inviting, Jack knew that he was ready to embrace the sea once more, this time with the respect and preparation it deserved.